My gosh. That's another one from David Crayon, and I just like it because it's interesting. What do you think of CBS reviving the Twilight Zone? And do you have a favorite episode from the original series? Those are great questions. Is it Jordan Peele who's redoing it? It doesn't matter who's redoing it. They've tried to redo it several times. Um, they have given it a shot many, many times. And the only problem with with the reboots of the Twilight Zone is that they don't have Rod Serling in them, and and the, you can't divorce them. The Twilight Zone. Rod Serling wasn't a host for hire. And Rod Serling wasn't just a writer on some of the best episodes. It was Rod Serling's baby, start to finish. And to say that we're going to make a Twilight Zone without Rod Serling is to simply say we're going to try and ape Rod Serling, and what you'll end up with is somebody who's not Rod Serling pretending to be Rod Serling, and it's just yeah. And Mr. Settle says it's all horrible SJW nonsense, which we knew it would be. The Twilight Zone was brilliant, not only because Rod Serling was brilliant and because of the vibe that he brought to it. Rod Serling, there's a reason. It's not an accident that every single episode of the Twilight Zone started out with Rod Serling talking right at the audience. It's not an accident. I'm not aware that any other show has ever done that, by the way. It's like Gene Roddenberry getting out in front of every single episode of Star Trek and basically telling the audience, here's what it's going to be about. Peele's a talented guy, funny guy. Key and Peele, was it? On Comedy Central. Those two guys were brilliant sketch comedy guys. Brilliant. But again, everything had to be political. But my God, they were great. Um, so so you've got a show that began with the creator. He wasn't the writer, wasn't the host, wasn't the producer. He was all of those things, but he was the creator of the show. And he would come out and he would set up the episode. And by the time he was finished with that, was it a 60-second introduction? Less sometimes. By the time he was finished with that, you were already in the right headspace. You were already there. He his presence, if you really think, I've never really gone down this road before, but if you think about it, Rod Serling's ability, they do the opening scene, a little something or other, and then they do a swish pan, and there he'd be. He'd be up against the cigarette machine, or he'd be standing, he just appeared. He magically appeared. And and so that alone, just the fact that he's here, you know, he's gone, that alone was spooky and supernatural. And nobody realizes this, as epilogues as well, as Astronaut points out. It puts you in the mood, and you knew that you were about to go on a ride, and you knew where that place was going to take you. Now you could copy that kind of reversal story, that kind of half an hour reversal, which even the mediocre ones were really superb, and the great ones were just some of the greatest stories ever told, ever. You can copy that, but if you don't get introduced to it, if Rod Serling doesn't come out at the beginning of that show and escort you to your seat with his flashlight, then it's not gonna. It's just going to be another science fiction story. It's not going to be the Twilight Zone, because the Twilight Zone starts with Rod Serling, and that's all there's to it. This is like this idea of having a female James Bond. You can have a female named James Bond. I know her name isn't James Bond, but she's going to be James Bond, and you can call her James Bond, or you can call her Jane Bond, or you can call her whatever you want to, but you are just essentially taking the credibility of an existing character and stapling it onto something that it's not, and it's not going to work. And it's a sign further of laziness and venality that they don't just make a great story. Why not just make a great story about this? This if you want a black female spy, why don't you just write a story that's about a black female spy and don't try to convince me that this is James Bond or try to fig leaf it? It's not really James. Of course it is. Okay, so so Serling was amazing, and let's face it. I mean, he was quite a bizarre guy. I'm not talking about his real life. I don't know anything about his real life. His on-camera persona, his delivery was just unique. Is the nicest word I can think of. You know, I used to be able to do a passable Rod Serling, but he'd get out there and submitted for your approval. One Mr. Miller, who's about to take a trip into oddness and obsolescence. Accompanying him on that fateful journey is the mesmerizing sound of the Twilight Zone. I'm in. I'm ready. Go for it. So I don't see any way they can copy that. About my favorite episodes, I'd be hard pressed to pick one, but I guess I could. You know, it's not even my favorite episode, but every time I think about the Twilight Zone, this is the episode I think of. Always. And it's the episode with Agnes Moorehead, who plays a crazy old woman out in the country, all by herself out in this log cabin. And these little aliens appear, and they're trying to kill her. And naturally enough, she's just an old woman, and she's trying to defend herself against these little robotic kind of creatures. And so she's finally able to knock a couple of them out, and then she goes up to her attic and finds the flying saucer that these little creatures came from and smashes it to atoms. And you're thinking, thank God she's gotten rid of these horrible monsters. And as you pan around to see the other side of the saucer, it's got United States Air Force on the side. And you hear a little bit of I forget what it is exactly, some kind of radio dialogue saying, we've lost contact with our mission to so-and-so. It turned out that those little robots were American astronauts, and that she was some kind of giant monster. And that's the reversal. That's what the Twilight Zone is. The Twilight Zone is 28 minutes of setup to give you 10 seconds of something that you'll never forget, ever. I had a chance to show an episode to a millennial friend of mine, and I decided to show the episode where the woman goes in to have facial plastic surgery to correct her horrible deformity, and the entire episode takes place kind of in dark areas. You know, we can't let her see too much light, because if there's light, then it'll really disturb her, and so everybody's kind of in shadow. And then they finally getting ready to take the bandages off on the final attempt to make this woman's face right. And the bandages come off, and the woman underneath is gorgeous. And you finally get to see the doctors and the nurses, and the doctors and nurses are hideous. They're just hideous. And you just go, oh my God. Was it called The Eye of the Beholder? I think it was. It was called The Eye of the Beholder. Beauty's in the Eye of the Beholder. And in a world where everybody is ugly, and ugliness is accepted by everybody, a person who's beautiful is a freak. And then towards the end, I remember at the very, very end, another one of these guys, one of these people come in, and they treat him like a leper. And he talks like a leper. He's an incredibly handsome guy. And he comes in, he says, don't worry, they've made a place for us. We live out of sight so that we don't disturb other people, and we'll come with us, and we can go live on this island and not be quite as ashamed of ourselves. And it blew her mind. And that's because she'd never been exposed to the Twilight Zone before. But once you have had that experience once or twice, it's really it, right? I mean, there's nothing to add. It is 28 minutes of exposition for a 5-second or a 10-second, oh my God moment. And then you realize that everything, it's a paradigm shift. You realize that everything that you were, this is the genius of Serling and the Twilight Zone. It's the actual genius of it. Pretty much every one of these stories, certainly the great ones, grab you because they set you up to root for a certain side or a certain person, and at the end you find out, no, the person who you thought was the enemy was actually the good person. The person you thought was a good person was actually the enemy, and it was it's just uncanny, brilliant. I have to tell you, one of my favorite episodes, and I like this episode because of the subtlety of the writing. The Terror at 30,000 feet with Bill Shatner and the gremlin out on the wing tearing the plane apart, that was brilliant. The cornfield with Billy Mooney, who I've met and had a chance to thank for his work, that was brilliant. Lots and lots of them. But one of the ones I like the most is a very subtle one, and it's not. This is more of a redemption story. He did those sometimes too. Sometimes instead of a twist, the twist would be the redemption. I remember the one with Mickey Rooney, who wanted to be he was a jockey, and he'd thrown some races, and he wanted to get back in the business, but and Rooney, needless to say, just knocks us out of the park. He's just a little guy, and all his life he wanted to be big. And so he goes to sleep, and when he wakes up, he's huge. They built a set, and then they built that exact set scaled down by like 10%. Exactly the same. So now, after you've spent the first half of the show looking at Mickey Rooney walking around this apartment, now you're looking at the exact same apartment. Everything's in the same place. But Mickey Rooney is huge. And your brain tells you, well, he's just enormous now. He's bigger. Now he can't be a jockey anymore. And so it's, be careful what you ask for kind of story. But one of my favorite episodes, and certainly my favorite in the writing, is the episode with William Shatner where he and his newlywed wife are traveling in a car, and they break down in a small town, and it's going to take hours to fix the car. So they go to a diner, and inside the diner is this kind of novelty thing where you put in a penny, you press the button, and out comes some sort of mystic prediction. And that is, I'm speaking as a professional here, if you'll pardon my crapulence. That writing is magnificent. And the reason it's magnificent is because when you listen to it, you can clearly see why Shatner and his wife would believe that this thing is predicting the future. In other words, the things that are coming out of Zoltron, was it, I think, or something? Things that are coming out of this creature on a little printed piece of paper, in fact, do seem to be predicting the future. And he's convinced that this thing can predict the future. But the brilliance of that writing is, once you've seen the show and you know what happens, if you go back and look at it again, you'll find that the predictions that are made could have been completely random predictions. It just got spat out of a machine because that whole episode was about superstition. Shatner's character was a guy who believed in luck. He had a rabbit's foot and all. It's all of it was just to break you out of superstition. And then you think, man, is it going to kill him? Is it going to destroy him? That's what often happens in these stories. But in this particular story, it was actually a very elegant ending too. He's got his wife, and he's so hooked on the idea, a guy who believes so much in luck and fortune and signs and all the rest of it. Here he's got a connection to God. He's talking to the future. And this is all he's ever wanted, really. He wants some certainty about what's going to happen. That's the kind of guy he was, a nervous guy. And he ended up being kind of enveloped in kind of Rod Serling's grace somehow, because that story was about his ability to force himself to walk away from something that was clearly destroying his life. There was never a moment where it was revealed that it wasn't telling the future. In fact, as far as Shatner was concerned, it absolutely was telling the future. That's a nice thing to be able to do. But he finally realizes that their obsession with it is killing him and his wife, and so he simply walks away from something he very much wants. That's a powerful, powerful morality lesson. And the point is hammered home when Shatner and his young wife are saying, let's just get out of here, honey. This is just killing us. Let's get out of here. And as he gets up, he puts a tip down on the table, walking out. And as he's walking out, this older couple's walking in. The guy hasn't shaved and they're covered with sweat, and he's got a handful of pennies, and he walks up to the thing, and she says, okay, now ask it about this. And you realize this is what would have happened to him. This is precisely what would have happened to him if he had stayed, but he didn't. So instead of being stuck in this living hell of superstition, he's a free man. That's just how do you top that? I mean, but the writing, think about how difficult that would have to be. First of all, you'd have to come up with a plot where events in the future could be predicted by a piece of paper that maybe held 5-6 words on it. That's number one. Number two, they have to be things that could be believable, small things that could actually be believable. Number three, they had to be ambiguous enough. In other words, those cards could never say a blonde man is going to walk through the door at 4:15 p.m. You know, they were ambiguous, and finally, and much the hardest part of it is, they had to be feasibly random things, because the whole point is that luck doesn't exist and fate doesn't exist. That's the point they're trying to make. This obsession with superstition and so on is terrible. And so the suggestions had to have the appearance of being generated by random after the fact, because after the fact, you have to be able to see how much, this is the point, how much he read into these ambiguous statements, how much he read into those predictions. Brilliant. See if this is so much fun. I'm trying to think if there's anything else comes to mind right away. Lots of images of them come to me, but nothing with the power of that Agnes Moorehead one. For some reason, that one just never, ever left me. There was another show like that called The Outer Limits. I don't know what's going on here. I really don't know what's going on. Outer Limits, I thought, was far inferior. However, I saw as a little boy, I mean a young boy, 5-6 years old, really interested in space stuff and, Lost in Space and all that stuff. And my dad told me that there was going to be a movie out called Robinson Crusoe on Mars, and I just, it's like vibrating, to go see this thing. Adam West was in that movie. So there was one Outer Limits episode, and as usual, it was astronauts crashed on a planet, and there was a sort of a giant sea of sand out there and rocks, and inside the sand lived kind of like a sandworm from Dune. Much cheesier, obviously, but still. I remember watching that and how the guys had to go from rock to rock to rock to try to get away from this thing. And I remember watching that thinking, that is just bloody terrifying. It is scary as hell. This is the kind of thing that I want to be an astronaut for, because I want to figure out how to get around things like this. And if I have to use my trusty blaster, then that's what I'll do. It went right through me. I just loved it. Every now and then when you're young, something hits you the right way, and it just stays with you. I think I mentioned once before the most amazing movie I ever saw in my life, in terms of what I remember as my experience in the theater. The most amazing movie ever made was called Battle Beneath the Earth. Starts out with an obviously crazy man on the streets of Vegas, I want to say, and he's listening to the cement. He says, "Don't you hear him down there? You can hear him, the Chinese." And the whole movie was about how the Chinese had built this laser tank, and this laser tank was boring tunnels between China and the U.S., and they were going to invade. It's no big deal, just kind of come across the Pacific underwater. They were going to invade, and they had this kind of really sophisticated kind of laser tank. So the Americans have to throw together something, and it's kind of chuck a laser onto a jeep, and then sure enough, there's a battle beneath the earth, and one of the scenes had this Chinese kind of Mandarin, really kind of a kind of a Dr. Wu kind of guy in military outfit, and he gets into this little container and closes it, and then he's just pneumatically shot back to China and back again, like he's a bunch of receipts in one of those bank teller things, drive-in bank thing. Wow, that's the most amazing movie ever made. And then I saw it again. I looked it up on YouTube. I don't know, 10 years ago now, maybe, something. And I was utterly convinced that somebody had remade the movie and remade it much worse. But sure enough, it was the same movie. I used to think my Aunt Marty's house was the biggest structure in the world as well. And then I get back to that as an adult, and I look around and it's unbelievable. But, yeah, that's about it. Guys, if you don't mind, I think I'm going to call it a night. I definitely am just about out of juice here, and I'm going to, I've gotten this thing finally behind me, going to record it tomorrow morning, and I have to be in here bright and early tomorrow morning to meet Scott for recording another Build Now episode, so I would really like to get a little sleep. And then I've got, 6 more episodes to go. I was able to do an interview yesterday, again, not really widely publicized, but I did an interview yesterday. I don't think I've ever had so much fun. Not just in an interview, I just don't know that I've ever had more just sheer kind of fun as I had yesterday. I interviewed Peter Robinson, who does Uncommon Knowledge at National Review, and Peter Robinson was the guy who wrote Reagan's "Mr. Gorbachev, Tear Down This Wall" speech. He changed history. He really did. And we not only talked about how he got that speech, but we talked about the whole Cold War. And I started this thing out by saying, Peter, I've heard the Cold War described in terms of military terms. I've heard it in terms of economic terms, heard it in terms of political terms. But the one thing that I never hear is a discussion of the morality gap, of the difference between these two sides. Cold War is always treated as if it's Team A and Team B, red team and blue teams, Coke versus Pepsi, and no one ever talks about the indescribable chasm between the Americans and the Russians in terms of morality. When I was writing the script, I remember writing Stalin, leader of the Soviet Union, Joseph Stalin, personally signed 40,000 death warrants. There were millions of people killed, but he signed 40,000 ones in person, including virtually all of his family and virtually all of his friends. Dwight Eisenhower, President of the United States, once got so angry he threw a golf club at an aide. And if you think that those things are equivalent, you are very, 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 very ill. Very ill. And I just piled on, Head of the Soviet spy agency, NKVD, Lavrentiy Beria, raped no less than 70 women. He would drive down the streets of Moscow late at night. He'd find somebody who he thought was attractive, and then his agents would go and take this person, literally snatch her off the street, take her back to his official residence, and he would rape them there. And many of these girls were 14, 15 years old. Some of them he murdered. One of the people who survived it went on to be an actress, a famous Russian actress, and she said that when he got there, he just looked at her and said, Scream or not scream, doesn't matter. Nobody's going to hear you, and I don't care. So that's the chief of the Soviet intelligence agency, a guy who had raped scores and scores, probably hundreds of women, and murdered significant number, dozens of them probably, with his own hands. And the American spy chief, Alan Dulles, had a consensual affair with the Queen of Greece. And again, you can't understand that story. You can't understand the history unless you understand that. No one talks about it. No one. So I led off with that, and from that point on, we were just on a roll, you know. And it was great to talk to somebody who had worked so closely with Reagan, and who was able to explain all of the things that Reagan was doing behind the scenes. You know, what his motivations were, and one of the things that we kind of came to agree on. It's not that it was news or anything. It was just kind of interesting. We both got there independently, coming at it from different ways, and that is that Truman was the president at the beginning of the Cold War, and Reagan was the president at the end of it. And the one thing those two people had in common were they were not the products of they weren't lawyers. They didn't go to Harvard. I don't think Truman went to college. Reagan went to Aurora College. None of them had that kind of blue-blooded Brahmin sort of upbringing. And because they didn't get tainted by that whole foggy bottom, State Department, professional diplomats, hail fellow, well met kind of thing, because they didn't have those blinders on, Reagan and Truman were the only ones who really saw just what they were up against. Not who they were up against, what they were up against. The interview's not out yet, by the way. Just shot it yesterday. I think Daily Wire said they might release it in one piece. I suggested they use it to promote the show. But again, I don't want to go too far out in the woods here until they do an actual, some kind of promotion. But in any event, I'm quite sure they'll do the whole interview, which was an hour. And I've never had that much fun, honestly. I can't explain why. I think probably what it was, and I think it was kind of this feedback loop, where I finally found somebody who not only knew more about something I was interested in than I did, but was actually there firsthand. That was really exciting. And I suspect for Peter, if I had to guess, it was probably the only time he'd ever been interviewed by somebody who understood that material well enough to ask him questions that he'd never answered before, or in some cases never even thought of before. And that was very flattering for me, and historic and memorable, and I had a wonderful time. I just think he's a great, 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 great guy. I did not ask him what a vapor barrier is, Steve Darrow, but I believe the vapor barrier is that part of the wall between the inside and the outside part of a building that prevents moisture from flowing in or something like that. I remember that back from my construction days. Anyway, sorry to have to bug out after only an hour and a half, but I'm bugged, and I really need to get some sleep before I record this thing tomorrow. And hopefully, and certainly, I will be back on the horse then. I've got to deliver pretty much an episode a week. It's a lot of writing. Just part 4 alone was 9,000 words. That's, I don't know, 5 or 6 firewalls, something like that. Anyway, as soon as they're done, I will be able to get back on that horse. Right now, it's just overwhelming. It's just a crushing kind of a psychological thing that's hanging over me. But I'm having fun doing it, and we'll certainly promote it. And we'd like to hope that we can start to build up an evidence for a kind of build up an audience for a sort of historical podcast kind of thing that I would do with them from time to time. Eric Blake wants to know if we can do a movie show next time. I'd love to. I just usually forget. Somebody wants to ping me about it. That'd be great. But until then, I think I'm gonna cheese it. So once again, this show's made possible by the paying members of BillWhittle.com. Keep the lights open, keep the doors lit, and who allow me to take my wife to Mexico and show my stepdaughter the best birthday of her life by far. by far. Just the entire 5 days I was there, and she's still there. She'll come back. She and her daughter have been together. She'll come back on Saturday. The entire time, my stepdaughter was just on the verge of tears. She simply couldn't believe that somebody was doing something for her like that. And I was able to do that because many of you out there are parting with $9.95 a month, and I wanted you to know, as I always try to let you know, that it means the world to me, and we're very grateful. So on behalf of me and my wife and my stepdaughter, I have a little family now. Thanks very much for the support. And if you're not a member, we certainly could use it. Anyway, Trevor wants to know if he can borrow $10. I said, the problem is, Trevor, all I've got is hundreds. I mean, I've just got, I don't have room for the 20s or the 10s in my wallet. My wallet's it's just like this big, just stuffed with brand new $100 bills, and I'm afraid I can't help you, pal. Anyway, that'll do it for this Stratosphere Lounge. I have a few thumbnails I have to make, and then I have to hit the road, Jack. And I'm not coming back no more until tomorrow morning. Okay, good seeing everybody. Take care of yourselves out there, and we will see you next week right here on the Stratosphere Lounge.